Of course, it's been since October 7th of 2023 that they've been able to see their loved ones. The IDF saying a hug 477 days in the making. Standing by to discuss is Dr. Alon Burstein. Alon, it's good to see you. As I mentioned, it's not often we get to talk about happy news when it relates to this war, but it's awesome to see those photos and watch the videos. But we were watching Mike's package together, and he said in his report, fragile ceasefire. Why do we hear the word fragile?
Good to see you, Austin. The ceasefire itself, or the truce agreement actually, is unto itself fragile. And in the last days, specifically even the last hour, we have seen violations of the agreement, which is making everyone worried. The agreement itself is fragile because right now it is built sort of stage by stage. There are now going to be releases of hostages every 7 days in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners, but everything about the deal, the order in which the hostages are released, the amount of Palestinian prisoners who are released, where they will be released to, are they deported to or not, the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza, IDF withdrawal and redeployment from the Netzarim corridor, all these things are scheduled to happen over the next 6 weeks. Each one of those facets is fragile. Each one of those facets can have kinks in it. Each one of those facets is not, I will say, completely ironed out in the deal. When I was myself reporting on the deal, I was talking about some of the things that are left relatively vague. For example, Palestinian pedestrians are allowed to return to northern Gaza as long as they are not armed, and they do not have to be searched. In turn, vehicles do have to be searched, but there is no mention of, okay, so how is it going to be verified that the pedestrians are not armed if they are not searched? Clearly, the IDF is going to search them. That's going to be seen as a violation of the deal, or they're not going to be searched. That's not mentioned. So it's fragile because a lot of the different facets of the deal are on shaky grounds. With that, there have been violations of the deal already. The first violation was not seen as that big. That happened on the day that the deal started. Hamas was late in submitting the list of hostages who will be released. Since then, however, we have seen more substantial violations. The biggest one thus far is that one of the female civilian hostages, Arbel Yehud, was not released. According to the terms of the deal, she was supposed to be released before the release of the female IDF soldiers. She was not released today. Now, theoretically, this might not have been a violation if she was dead, because it's supposed to release only the live people. However, in Israel, there seems to be the belief that she is alive, and Hamas did in fact say, well, she is alive, she'll be released next week. So Israel in turn said, okay, if that's the case, Israel's not going to live up to its side of the deal that was supposed to happen today. It's not going to evacuate the Al-Rashid Road and allow Palestinian civilians to return north. That was supposed to happen after the release of the female civilian hostages. In turn, Hamas, half an hour ago, was supposed to deliver a list of how many of the hostages that are to be returned in the first phase of the deal are alive and how many are dead. It hasn't done that. So we're seeing more substantial violations already, even as we speak. Will this lead to complete collapse of the deal? At this point, probably not. But each side is really starting to test the patience of the other side in terms of its violations, in terms of almost a game of chicken. What are you going to do next if I don't live up to my end of the bargain?
I mean, saying that one hostage is alive and is going to be returned and then not following through on that, that seems like a big deal. Is that causing some suspicion as to what might be going on there?
So again, at this point, it's hard to say. Initially, the way the deal was structured, there was supposed to be the release of all female hostages, all female civilians and children, then female IDF soldiers, then the elderly males, and then the injured males. But it also says, and all who are alive will be released before all who are dead. So when there are more than that one female civilian that I said, there's also Shiri Bibas and her kids. However, Hamas already announced that they were dead over a year ago. So it was to some extent, unfortunately, not surprising that they were not on the list of those to be released now initially. They are probably dead and their bodies will be returned later. However, there's been no life sign or declaration of death of Arbel Yehud. So she was supposed to be released now. Then when Hamas yesterday said they're going to release the 4 female IDF soldiers in Israel, there was a big dilemma. Well, what do we do? Do we blow up the deal and say, no, if you don't release the female civilian, then we're not going to accept the 4 female IDF soldiers? So of course in Israel, they decided, no, we will accept those soldiers. We want them released. But then Israel said, but in turn, we're not going to hold up to our next stage of the deal. So, blaming which side violated first yes, Hamas, in this moment, Hamas violated first. But both sides are saying, well, yeah, but it's not a big deal. Hamas is saying, it's not a big deal. We'll release her next week. She's being held by a different organization. Thus, we had a problem doing that. Now, Israel, you're going to blow up the deal and not get the rest of your hostages back from the first phase. It's a game of chicken. It's a game of chicken that each side is playing. Israel also, the biggest leverage that it has at the present time is the Netzarim corridor, is not allowing Palestinian civilians to return north. Once that starts, it's going to be very hard to stop it. So that is why Israel said, okay, then we're not going to live up to our end of the deal. It's supposed to start tonight of evacuating the Netzarim, parts of the Netzarim corridor and allowing Palestinian civilians to go north. So on the one hand, obviously, it's a big deal and the lives of every hostage count, the lives of every person counts on the one hand. On the other hand, it's almost within this sick game of hostages. It's a question of how much value do you place? Do you say, I'll blow up the deal because I'm not going to receive, because I was supposed to receive that hostage first? That would come at the expense of other hostages or not. And Hamas was sort of counting on the fact that Israel wouldn't blow up the deal, as in fact, at least until now, it did not.
So hostages are one part of the story, but 200 Palestinian prisoners being released in exchange for those hostages. You and I have talked about this several times over the course of this war alone, but let's put a fine point on this. In general, who are these prisoners and why do they matter?
So when the topic of Palestinian prisoners is discussed, who these are, they are Palestinians almost entirely from the West Bank and some now from the Gaza Strip who have been arrested by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and sentenced to jail within the Israeli military court system. The range of crimes ranges from active terror attacks and murder to planning terror attacks to things that are much more minor violations. It could be stone throwing, it could even be graffitiing or being a member of an organization that is suspected of committing acts of violence. So the range of Palestinian prisoners and who they are is extremely wide. That is the reason there's often a distinction drawn between what is called, quote unquote, heavy Palestinian prisoners. Those are Palestinian prisoners that are usually sentenced to life in jail in Israeli prisons, and that's usually for either carrying out or planning terror attacks against Israelis. And then the rest of the Palestinian prisoners often are more either associated with terror organizations, it could be affiliated with disseminating publications, it could also be if you spray painted graffiti that had the name of a terror organization, that into itself was a crime within the Palestinian territory. So there's a wide range. In total, up until now, 7 hostages have been released in exchange for 290 Palestinian prisoners. In exchange for the first release of the 3 female civilians, 90 Palestinian prisoners were released, and they were not heavy Palestinian prisoners. They were women and children who were held for different things in Israeli jails. Now, in exchange, according to the terms of the deal, in exchange for the release of the 4 female IDF soldiers, the price is much higher. 200 Palestinian prisoners were released, but that includes 120 of them who were serving life sentences in Israel. That usually means that either they took an active part in carrying out acts of terror or are more higher up in the leadership of terror organizations over the years, and they have now been released. Some of them, as I think was said in the report, were expelled from the region, either to this time was to Egypt, sometimes going to be to Qatar or other places. The rest were released, most of them back to the West Bank. Some of them are going to be released to the Gaza Strip also. And
we both know that Yahya Sinwar, the former internal leader of Hamas, was one of those heavy prisoners at one point. Before we go, Alon, where do we go from here? There's still more to come. This is only the first phase, if you will, but what is to come? What do we look for next?
So I'll say a couple of things, and cut me off when I go too long. First, we are now looking, in terms of Gaza, we are now looking at each phase of the implementation of this deal. So the next phase is supposed to be next week on Saturday is going to be the next release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. We're also going to start to see other mechanisms of this deal. Among them, a very interesting facet, is Israel's going to allow the entrance of industrial equipment to start coming into the Gaza Strip in order to start clearing the rubble that has accumulated in a year and change of bombardments. And that is coming under a lot of scrutiny because some of those tractors that are coming in, for example, are the same types of tractors that Hamas had used to carry out the October 7th attack to break through the fence. Now Israel's delivering them to essentially the Hamas administration in the Gaza Strip. So that's one facet. Then there's also negotiations over the second phase of the deal. 2 more things that are very important to look at when we're looking at the war in 2 different arenas. One is the West Bank. Israel officially, as a result of this deal and passing it through the government, Israel officially changed its war aims and now includes within the war aims of the Israel-Hamas War what is called restoring security in the West Bank. As a result, a massive IDF operation has been launched in Jenin, and it is currently ongoing. And we have seen also the IDF deploy massive checkpoints throughout the West Bank. So that's slowly becoming another arena. And a third arena that's very, very important to take note of is Lebanon. On Sunday, January 26th, the 60-day transition period in the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon is ending. At the end of that transition period, the Lebanese military was supposed to deploy its forces in southern Lebanon, and the IDF was supposed to withdraw all of its forces. Israel has announced that the IDF is not going to withdraw all of its forces from southern Lebanon. It says that the Lebanese military has deployed, but hasn't deployed enough. It hasn't been effective enough in actually carrying out operations against Hezbollah. Hezbollah has made a lot of threats, but hasn't actually threatened to take action. It has called on Lebanon to view this as a major violation of the Lebanese military to act against the IDF. Likely, again, we will not see this entire deal exploding, but that is another arena that, for the last 60 days has been calm, but now we're starting to see also there some violations or some pushback, and we'll see where that develops. So all of these arenas, very explosive.
Right. Alon, it's been too long. We'll be talking soon, and it'll be interesting to see over time how the calculus in the Middle East changes now that Trump is in the White House and now that some of his cabinet nominees are starting to be confirmed. Alon, we'll talk soon. Thanks.